Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
I do think that the Conservative Party has run out of road. Their project is faltering. They're in decline. They're sliding into the abyss. Politics is about choices. And the choice at the moment is between the choice of a Labour government that thinks that stable finances are at the heart of building better lives for working people, or Nigel Farage and Reform, who only this week said they would spend billions upon billions upon billions, tens of billions of pounds in an unfunded way, which is the exact repeat of what Liz Truss did.
So Keir Starmer clearly thinks Reform are the real opposition, but do the party's economic policies stack up? You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. So Reform are riding high in the polls. A string of recent surveys put the party in first place with the support of about 30% of voters. And their leader, Nigel Farage, was in the US this week. He was launching another eye-catching policy on supporting crypto. But with the party talking up the prospect of actually entering government, as you say, Yuan, the question is, do they actually have a coherent economic plan?
Well, in Reform world, there's plenty of money for tax cuts and selective increases in public spending. The party's last manifesto committed to £90 billion a year in tax cuts and spending increases of £50 billion a year. Those were Reform's own estimates, pretty sizable in themselves. But according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the cost of the party's pledges on both tax and spending actually amount to much more than this. And the new pledge this week to scrap the two-child benefit cap, effectively increasing the welfare bill for mostly non-working families. I think that's interesting for what it tells us about how the party intends to position itself as it looks to reach further into the electorate.
So let's stop talking about them and hear from them. We interviewed Reform UK's chair, Yusef, on Bloomberg this morning, and we asked him what their economic plan for government would actually look like.
Well, look, we're still some years away from the general election, but absolutely we've already got a brilliant team of people working on a multitude of the sections that you need for a strong economic policy. And look, what our economic policy will do is kickstart growth again in this country. We need UK GDP and more importantly, UK GDP per capita to be growing up at 3 to 4% again. If we cannot do that, then frankly, for our children and their children, there's simply no way to pay the bills, given the size of things like the pensioner population, etc. How are we going to do that? We need to lean into Britain's strengths. We have a formidable financial services sector on a relative basis, not as strong as it once was, and frankly has been smothered and clobbered by EU regulation. We have this country has failed as a result of Tory mismanagement to make the most of the Brexit freedoms that we've been granted. Our crypto and digital assets bill starts to do just that. Similarly, we need to lean into AI. This country still has a significant percentage of the world's finest AI talent. We do very little with that commercially in terms of generating value for the British economy and helping British people get richer. Obviously, we've had mass immigration in this country, which people are very, very angry about. That is one reason why we're polling not just ahead of the Prime Minister's party now, but in the gold standard YouGov poll last week, we were full 8 points clear, which is pretty astonishing for a party that won such a walloping majority under a year ago.
So that was Reform UK's chair, Yusef, speaking to Caroline Hepker earlier on Bloomberg Radio. Now, this is a subject that gets very heated, isn't it? And we wanted to analyse it in an impartial, objective way. So we've brought in our chief UK economist, Dan Hanson. Dan, when you hear this economic policy from Reform, how would you characterise it?
Bold. Very bold.
Realistic?
I think it's really interesting, and the polls don't lie, do they? So there is something in it that people like the look of, and people are sort of listening to. How much of it is the Farage Factor? How much of it is the economic policy? There's a question mark about that. I think if you're being sort of analytically cold about it, it really pushes against sort of mainstream economics in terms of thinking about fiscal prudence, fiscal sustainability. The implication of the plans is an enormous rise in borrowing. And of course, the Prime Minister has spoken about Liz Truss and what happened in that episode. And I think as things stand, the market would not take kindly to what they're proposing, what Reform are proposing. That said, you heard it there from the chairman of Reform that they've got some time. They've got 3 or 4 years to look at this. And we've seen what's going on in the US as well. And I think there's a real question generally around fiscal policy, at least for me, that there is a desire to not raise taxes much more, and Reform are talking about big tax cuts. We know we're fiscally constrained. We know all the figures are tight. I think what's really interesting, what I'm hearing from them, is on spending, and they're sort of thinking about spending and what public service provision should be. They're questioning that, and that is I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's a question that the government, whoever it may be in the next parliament, really needs to think about, because
pretty radical.
It is radical, but equally, it is the area that we sit here and talk about tight spending plans, but no one really talks about rethinking how the government spends its money, because obviously that would require a huge amount of reform and change. But actually, there is, I think, a really important question about, is the government providing the right services and the money going in the right place? And reform is sort of, it's knocking at that door, and we're seeing it in the US as well. The Doge experiment has shown that it's very difficult to do this sort of thing and make these changes. But actually, I think fundamentally there is a question about government provision, what the government provides in a world of very, very sort of tight fiscal constraints.
I just want to pick up on something that Yusef said earlier. He talked about aiming for 4% growth in GDP per capita. Back in the Blair years, I think we managed about 1.5% per capita, and that was a really good period of economic growth for the UK. So just how big a deal is, how big is 4%?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges Reform would potentially have, and this is one of the issues that Liz Truss had, and in the mini budget and Kwasi Kwarteng when he was Chancellor, is that the claim was that these changes would boost economic growth and effectively they would pay for themselves by cutting taxes and the like. That's one of the many things the market sort of balked at on that day, and sort of that's why we had this enormous sell-off in the gilt market, which obviously turned into something a lot more significant subsequently. So I think there is a real risk, Yuan, that if you come in saying, we're going to lift growth to 4%, GDP per capita growth to 4%, if you compare that to what the target the government has set itself, it is just looking to raise living standards over the parliament. So that is GDP per capita being higher by the end of the parliament than it is today. So that means you can grow by a tiny amount over 5 years. If you're growing by 4% a year for 5 years over a parliament,
that's a lot.
It's 20% higher. The government is just saying it just needs to be marginally higher to meet the goal. And that, is a recognition of the fact that the thing that drives real GDP per capita growth in the medium term is productivity growth, and we don't have that here in the UK. So if reform came in and we're saying we're going to deliver this and pay for this by boosting economic growth to that degree, that would just not be credible.
Well, yeah, so can I weave these two strands together? Because we started off talking about public spending cuts in a radical way. Now we're talking about growth and productivity. If you were to, for example, massively cut the NHS budget, trim back the NHS, more than trim, slash the NHS in big ways, would that add to productivity and growth? Maybe not to those levels of 4%, but would it take us towards Reform's growth target?
Look, I think if you look in the data, you can see that the health sector has been a drag on productivity growth and productivity itself, the level of productivity. I think, there are, and if you're looking at it sort of through the cold lens of GDP and GDP per capita, yes, you could make an argument like that. There are, of course, much wider considerations when you're talking about than GDP, when you're talking about public sector provision, and that's a sort of broader question. It's ultimately it's for the electorate to decide. There is this gap in the UK between what's going on in the private sector, where productivity growth is weak, and the public sector the public sector has been even weaker productivity growth. So you have got this drag. It's in the data. There are measurement issues around it and things like that. So we shouldn't sort of jump straight to conclusions. But I think it does go to that broader point that I made at the start, that there are questions around provision, and I'm not picking on the NHS at all. I just think the broader provision that the government provides and how taxpayers' money is spent, that's the sort of question, the really interesting question I think Reform is sort of raising in this country, and I think it will be an interesting question going into the next election.
I don't want to get into all the weeds of the policy proposals, but one very eye-catching money spinner is Reform say they'd stop paying the Bank of England, or they'd get the Bank of England to stop paying interest to commercial banks on QE reserves, they save £35 billion a year. Now that sounds like an easy win. What are the implications of that?
So this one's really, you're right, this one's really in the weeds. So what the Bank of England did when it undertook QE was it bought government bonds from banks and in return gave them reserves, which is effectively cash, a call on the Bank of England. And the Bank of England pays an interest. So the interest rate the Bank of England sets is what is paid on that reserve. And at the time, if my memory serves me correctly, that there was £700 billion worth of reserves, QE reserves, in the private sector, swilling around in the private sector, and the bank rate was 5.25%. So you multiply those two numbers together, you get £35 billion. Now, as part of the proposal, Reform was saying the Bank of England should stop running down those reserves, which is what we call quantitative tightening, so reducing the balance sheet, reducing the QE reserves in the system. Now, of course, that's a monetary policy decision. So the first thing to say is what they're saying is effectively taking a monetary policy decision out of the hands of the Bank of England, which obviously is a risky thing. The broader question about reserves and the broader concern about what's been going on with QE is that the Bank of England is obviously paying the private sector quite a significant amount of interest, and the concern is that banks are making excess profits. So if banks are making excess profits, what is the best way to deal with that? It would be to tax them more. If they are making excess profits, they will pay tax. If they're not making excess profits, they won't pay tax. So that's the way. That's where to, in my opinion, anyway, to where to levy that, or where to, if you were trying to deal with that excess profit making, that's how to levy it, is through taxes rather than through affecting how reserves are remunerated.
Yeah.
Because, sorry, Lizzy, just let me finish. It's because if you start interfering with the remuneration, it potentially affects how monetary policy is transmitted to the economy, which is the last thing we want.
All I wanted to ask you, though, was if it were that easy, why hasn't anyone else done it?
Well, the Governor of the Bank of England has said this is a decision for the government in terms of how they want to do this, but the Bank of England is very clear that they want to continue with the current setup. It is a tax on banks if you start not paying that money to them, and so it becomes a very sort of fuzzy line between fiscal policy and monetary policy. And as I say, I think given the risks involved in, if you don't remunerate any reserves, the Bank of England will lose control of money market interest rates, so they will lose control of their ability to transmit monetary policy to the economy. If this point in time, or at any point in time I should say, but particularly the period we've just gone through, that's the last thing we need, is to create more uncertainty about how monetary policy is transmitting to the economy. If it's true that banks are making excess profits, which is possible, but that will show up on their bottom line, and the government could say, fine, we're just going to tax you on that profit. I think going down the reserves route, it's just very muddy, very complicated, and it's just, for me at least, easier left alone.
On the productivity question, it kind of sounds like they're going beyond efficiency. Every government calls for efficiency, but this is more than moving deck chairs on the Titanic. They actually want to do something fundamental when it comes to spending cuts. Is there anything else that's radical about the economic proposals from Reform?
I mean, I think the whole agenda is pretty radical. As I said at the start, I think it's important to have these debates about, we're sort of nipping and tucking around different policy. If you looked at the policy proposals in the last election, other than reforms, which were radical, and we've sort of been going through, and I think they are radical. Labour's manifesto contained, I remember off the top of my head, sort of these very small numbers and very tiny things, and Tories as well, very small numbers. And I think it's important to have a debate about thinking more widely. The arguments around AI. I mean, I think it's really interesting about, the question about reforms saving around net zero. That is hugely radical. £45 billion, I think, is their number. doesn't strike me that they would save that amount of money given the sort of estimates that are out there. So there's a question about the credibility of the number. But in terms of putting that forward as a proposal...
For anyone who hasn't heard of that, about that, what is it that they're proposing?
They're scrapping... They're going to say that one of the savings to pay for the big tax cuts that they're proposing, so the biggest of which is raising the personal allowance from £12,500 to £20,000, which would cost somewhere in the region of £60 to £70 billion, which is just an enormous amount of money. It's sort of, if you think about it, it's 2 to 3% of GDP. It's enormous. One of the ways they're talking about making the savings to pay for that is scrapping the government's the outlays the government will make getting to net zero by 2050. So that's one of the things they're talking about. And of course, more broadly, talking about, going to your question, Lizzy, talking about crypto, talking about AI. AI is something that we definitely need to talk about more seriously in the context of the productivity puzzle. So I think it's interesting. I think I could be wrong, but 4 years out from, it might be 3 years, maybe 4 years out from the next general election, it's almost unheard of that the opposition party is making this much of a wave in the press, and clearly got the government worried. We can see that. Questions about, has Farage peaked too soon? Who knows? He's been around a long time. But I think it's really interesting, and you've seen Labour respond already with what they're doing on migration, and it's affecting how they set policy. So, and I think that is actually the interesting thing for the here and now, is that it's affecting the policies that are being implemented by the government of the day. It's not just about what might happen in 4 years' time when we go to the polls.
Dan, really interesting to get your thoughts. That's our chief UK economist, Dan Hanson. Now, I think it's a long time to the general election, as you say, but if Reform can maintain this poll lead, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on their economic policies. So I think we'll be coming back to this many times.
Yeah, they got us talking. That's it from us for today, though. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock, and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. We'll be back with more next week. This is Bloomberg.